Hello and welcome to this online video training for site supervisors on the supervisory process, provided by the City University of Seattle's Master of Arts in Counseling program. This training is designed for new and also experienced site supervisors who would like information about the expectations of site supervisors in the Master of Arts in Counseling program, as well as getting oriented to the basics of supervision. So here's the overview of our video training today. We will be looking at the expectations of site and faculty supervisors, the goals of supervision, the role of the supervisor, approaches to supervision, and supervision formats. The first section is on roles, responsibilities, and contracts regarding expectations of faculty and site supervisors. This is the orientation to the terrain. The faculty and site supervisor roles in regards to a student's field experience are as follows. For faculty supervisors, they are held responsible for evaluating students after consulting with the site supervisor. So the faculty supervisor is responsible for student evaluation. Faculty supervisors remain in contact with the site supervisor throughout the field experience, and usually this happens at discrete periods, for example, at the end of a quarter when a student is evaluated, at the beginning or at the end of a field experience such as a practicum or an internship. In addition, there may be occasions that arise during the student's field experience outside of those discrete periods of evaluation, and in those cases the faculty supervisor provides support and guidance as needed to the site supervisor. In addition, the faculty supervisor provides remedial training as needed if the site supervisor notices that a student is deficient or lacking in a particular area and needs some extra support. The faculty supervisor also provides an hour and a half of group supervision per week. The site supervisor directly oversees supervisory interactions with clients in the setting. They also oversee just the supervisor's interactions with the setting itself, like with staff, for example, or with some of the other interns at the site. The site supervisor also assists the student to adhere to policies, procedures, and demands of the site, what would be considered localized knowledge. Finally, the site supervisor also provides 1 hour of individual or triadic supervision per week. Triadic supervision means supervision involving 2 supervisees and a supervisor. Either individual or triadic supervision is fine. It has to be provided 1 hour every week. The contract of supervision defines the following: the purpose and goals of supervision, what the supervisee is expected to accomplish by the conclusion of their experience, what the site would like the supervisee to accomplish, what the student's own goals are that they wish to accomplish. In addition, the activities at the site are outlined, so the specific activities the student is engaged in, whether that be, for example, case management, or individual counseling, or assessment activities, or basic observational activities, co-leadership of groups, those kinds of activities. Logistics, such as the frequency and duration of the student's participation at the site and the frequency and duration of supervision that occurs during the student's field experience, is outlined in the contract, as well as the roles and responsibilities of the supervisor and supervisee as noted above. A brief description of the supervisor's background or experience. This usually just features the supervisor's educational background, their license, any supervision training they've received, and evaluation methods to be used during the process of the field experience, and this is accomplished by the faculty supervisor with consultation from the site supervisor. The contract also includes the supervisee's commitment to function within their level of competence, provide informed consent to clients, follow legal and ethical standards, and to follow the direction of the site supervisor and faculty supervisor, except in cases, of course, when following that direction would be unethical. And also reporting procedures for legal, ethical, and emergency situations. Those situations where we need our supervisees to be providing information to their direct supervisor in order to manage those situations as best possible. So we just looked at some of the expectations and roles, responsibilities, the contracts of the faculty and site supervisor. We're now going to look at the goals of supervision, what we want our supervisees to be learning in their experience. This is mapping the terrain. As we supervise and attempt to manage our supervision time, the following thoughts are important to consider. First, what outcomes are important to our trainees? What do we want them leaving with? What do they want or expect from us? What are their own goals? How does my supervisory style impact the achievement of desired goals for supervision? Meaning, is my style better suited to particular goals versus others? It's also worth noting that in many agencies, in fact 49% of agencies according to some research, supervision is provided by individuals who have dual roles, meaning administrative and clinical roles as supervisors. This is important to consider because interns, residents, even licensed personnel have to carefully consider what kinds of goals they want to achieve in their clinical supervision, and it affects how supervision is operated. For example, an employee may be less likely to divulge or disclose some information that might get them into trouble, even though it's pertinent clinical information, because their supervisor is also their administrative supervisor. So just something to be aware of and to discuss openly with any supervisee or employee you might have. Other factors impacting the supervisory relationship include the degree of trust between supervisor and supervisee, and of course that works both ways. The level of anxiety for both the supervisor and the supervisee. The parallel process that may occur between supervisor and supervisee, and parallel process refers to similar dynamics between supervisor-supervisee that occur between the supervisee-client. Supervisee transference, supervisor countertransference towards the supervisee, supervisor adherence to ethical guidelines, racial and gender identity interactions, role conflict or ambiguity. So, for example, a supervisee not quite understanding their role in the agency, being ambiguous about that, or the supervisor having just a really strong sense of their presence in an agency, having a firm sense of identity around their role, would be an example of a potential role conflict and lack of role conflict in the latter example. And then supervisor disclosure, meaning the presence or absence of the supervisor disclosing their own reactions to situations that the supervisee discloses. Other factors impacting the supervisory relationship include the clinical skills or knowledge of the supervisor, an accepting supervisory climate, so in situations where there's warmth, trust, and respect, that kind of climate is going to elicit a deeper sense of sharing, perhaps, a greater readiness to work on goals and objectives. Matching the supervisee level of development, and we'll look at some step models in terms of development a little later in this presentation. Providing constructive feedback, which I think is really important for most supervisees in terms of their own growth to get some feedback on their work, being flexible and available, the emotional bond of the relationship, and mutual agreement on the goals and tasks of supervision, meaning both the supervisor and the supervisee have an agreement on what is being discussed as part of supervision, that is important to both parties. So let's begin with the goals of supervision. There are three different approaches to goals, three different types of goals. The first is to develop proficient counselors by increasing their level of competency and self-efficacy. That's the first type of approach to goals. The second is to facilitate counselor development. That's the second type of approach to goals. And the third is to protect client welfare. That's the third approach. Let's look at the first approach, to develop a level of competency and self-efficacy in counselors. This follows Bandura's self-efficacy theory, which was the conviction or belief that one can successfully execute desired behavior. Having self-efficacy, or a belief in one's ability, impacts whether or not a given task is attempted, how much effort is spent on the task, and how long a response is maintained in the event of obstacles and stresses of life. The supervisee may think, for example, if I persist and finish a task that I might typically fail, my sense of efficacy is increased. In other words, I have more confidence in my abilities. Some stages of counselor development. This is the developmental model, the second type of goal. This follows Stoltenberg and McNeil's model, which was to move the supervisee to a more advanced developmental level. The first type of goal, obviously, is to increase the supervisee's sense of self-efficacy, or ability to achieve the task before them. So in Stoltenberg and McNeil's model, there are several levels. The first level, level 1 supervisee, is when a supervisee lacks confidence, is highly self-conscious with performance, is anxious about evaluation, demonstrates confusion about behaviors appropriate for professionals, has discomfort that motivates their actions, and is highly dependent on modeling and directive or direction in supervision. In other words, the supervisee is fairly anxious at the beginning stages of their training, needs a significant amount of support, is unclear about their role, and may be very self-conscious about their performance and evaluation. In the second level, the supervisee becomes aware of and attuned to the worldview of the client, but may struggle to retain objectivity. They may be more confident in their ability to empathically relate to the client. They may be more engaged in the process and less preoccupied with individual performance. May be somewhat erratically motivated, meaning at times they seem fairly motivated, other times not so much. At times overwhelmed by potential options and choices for treatment, just the sheer slew of choices or options in terms of when and where to intervene and how. And then transitioning from dependency to autonomy in supervision. This stage is particularly important to pay attention to because as the supervisee becomes more experienced, usually during the course of, say, an internship, by the conclusion of their internship they may feel at the point to which they can make their own decisions without needing the supervisor's constant and continual reassurance. And this may even cause friction within the relationship for supervisors who would prefer that the supervisee run everything by them before proceeding. Level 3 supervisees, which is fairly rare to find by the conclusion of an internship, even though it does occur, is a supervisee who demonstrates marked self-assurance, objectivity and intentionality, aware of dynamics in counseling, consistently motivated to enhance professional skill and identity, and functions independently and responsibly. Typically, we would anticipate someone moving into the level 3 supervisee stage by the conclusion of their residency. So you can see here that the goal in the developmental model is to help the supervisee to gradually move through these stages and to become more developed. Protecting client welfare is the third objective or goal of supervision. The first, of course, had to do with self-efficacy. The second had to do with counselor development. The third has to do with protecting client welfare. Training must not put clients at risk, and so this objective is an important one for supervision. That supervision provides some degree of accountability, of oversight of the supervisee's work in order to protect the client. By saying that training must not put clients at risk, we often have to balance assessing the capability of the trainee, which is often difficult. For example, we may think that some trainees are have the potential to do excellent work with difficult clients. And that may be the case. For other trainees, it might be much more difficult for them to take on a very difficult client case because they're not at the stage of development where they can handle that as well as a more seasoned professional. At the same time, without that experience, the trainee or the supervisee does not develop as quickly or in the same way. And so we have to balance the need of a client with the need of the supervisee. In addition to that, we are aware of trainee impairment and unethical behavior. Things like burnout or mental health issues that may come up as part of a trainee's development as a professional counselor. Things like boundary issues that the supervisee is navigating. And so we want to be aware of any potential impairment or any potential unethical behavior going on in order to protect client welfare. And in such instances, it would be a good idea to contact the faculty supervisor and have a discussion about the trainee's current level of performance. Because of Tarasov case law, we have to be particularly mindful to the supervisor's role in overseeing the student or the supervisee's work. In a Tarasov case law, a site supervisor was successfully sued by a family member, a party of a young woman who was killed by a client who came into a university counseling center and told the counselor that he was thinking about murdering a woman named Tatiana Tarasov. The counselor had warned their site supervisor, warned the authorities, and made some steps towards informing Tatiana Tarasov, but they did not go far enough. And so what we need to take from that case is that as site supervisors, it is very important to be aware of what your supervisee is doing, and in addition to that, to take the necessary steps along with your supervisee to ensure client welfare, particularly in the case of homicidal ideation, which is what happened with the Tarasov case, that a young woman was killed. This speaks to vicarious responsibility, that site supervisors, as with faculty supervisors, we are responsible for the behavior of our supervisees to some extent. And so we need to be aware of their behaviors and to protect client welfare at all costs. The supervisor's style, this is moving on from goals, typically varies. The perspectives of the supervisor also vary. There are predominant styles or roles that supervisors tend to take on, and these just depend on the approach of the supervisor. The first is an attractive style, meaning when the supervisor comes across as friendly, trusting, and supportive. The second is an interpersonally sensitive style. This is when the supervisor seems intuitive, invested, reflective. And the third is a task-oriented style. when the supervisor appears structured, goal-oriented, and evaluative. Neither style is better nor worse than the other. These are just different styles that a supervisor can take on as part of their supervision. So does supervisory style matter? Well, there are two directions to consider here, based on what was found in the research literature. The attractive and interpersonally sensitive styles seem to influence satisfaction with supervision, meaning supervisees were more receptive and preferred the attractive and interpersonally sensitive styles. However, task-oriented styles, the third type, influenced supervisees' perceived self-efficacy, while not necessarily as satisfied with supervision. The supervisees did develop a more advanced sense of confidence in their own abilities based on the task-oriented style. And so, depending on what the goal is of supervision, the supervisory style can affect how those goals are accomplished. So we've looked at some of the goals of supervision. Now we're going to look at the role of the supervisor. This is preparing for the journey. There are three predominant roles of the supervisor, according to Janine Bernard, who is fairly famous in writing about this topic. The three roles are teacher, counselor, and consultant. We're going to explore each of those roles in a certain amount of detail. Let's look at the supervisor as teacher. The supervisor as teacher remains in charge, determines the direction of the interaction, functions as an advisor or an expert, evaluates the observed session interactions, identifies appropriate interventions, teaches, demonstrates, or models, explains the rationale behind directives, and formulates hypotheses about cases. That's the role of the supervisor as teacher. We're going to now consider that role in a scenario. So let me read through the scenario, then I would like you to pause the video and consider how, as a teaching supervisor, how you would proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client. So here's the scenario. When reviewing your supervisee's work with a depressed client, you notice that your counselor is constantly generating options and problem solving for the client. Essentially, your counselor is doing the work for the client. So as the teaching supervisor, how will you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client? Pause the video now and explore that question. The supervisor as counselor is a bit of a different stylistic move. When the supervisor is the counselor, or has the role of a counselor, the focus of supervision is the supervisee as a person. The goal of the supervisor here is to facilitate supervisee self-growth. This uses more typical counseling skills. It's important, though, to articulate that the supervisee does not become a client. However, the counselor-supervisor does utilize many of the counseling behaviors. So the goal is to facilitate self-growth in order to help the client, but not to make the supervisee a client. So this is what this looks like, the supervisor as the counselor. They explore supervisee feelings during the counseling and or supervision session. They examine supervisee feelings concerning specific techniques and or interventions. They facilitate supervisee self-exploration of confidences and or anxieties in the supervision or counseling session. They help the supervisee develop or define personal competencies and areas for growth. They provide opportunities for supervisees to process their own affect, their emotional response, and their defenses. And they address things like transference, countertransference, biases, and cultural blind spots. So we're going to return to the same scenario as before, When reviewing your supervisee's work with a depressed client, you notice that your counselor is constantly generating options and problem solving for the client. Essentially, your counselor is doing the work for the client. So pause the video now and answer the following question. As a counseling supervisor, how will you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client? The supervisor as consultant has a focus on the client of the supervisee, rather than the supervisee themselves per se. This functions almost like a case review. It's focused on treatment planning, interventions are discussed. The goal of the supervisor is to generate information, to discuss the details of the case and explore possibilities. This allows the supervisee to exert overt control of the case, because the supervisee is the one usually providing the information. It also provides alternative options instead of answers, and encourages supervisee choice and responsibility. When the supervisor functions as the consultant, usually the supervisee is in Stoltenberg and McNeil's second stage at least of development. It is unusual for the supervisor to take a consulting role when the supervisee is in stage 1 of development. So the same scenario as before. When reviewing your supervisee's work with a depressed client, you notice that your counselor is constantly generating options and problem solving for the client. Essentially, your counselor is doing the work for the client. So pause the video now, and as a consulting supervisor, how will you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client? Okay, we've looked at the goals of supervision, the roles of the supervisor. Now we're going to look at approaches to supervision. This is choosing a path. The models you see up on the screen before you were taken from the Bernard and Goodyear text, looking at the very specific kinds of supervision models that one can choose to take. You'll notice that there are 3 main lines, or categories of approaches. The first is models grounded in psychotherapy theory. The second is developmental models. And the third is social role models. And you'll notice under social role models is the discrimination model. That's the teacher, counselor, client model that we, consultant model that we just looked at in terms of the supervisor's roles. We're going to look now at some of the models grounded in psychotherapy theory. The developmental models we looked at already to some extent as well, such as the stage models. That's level 1, level 2, that's Stoltenberg's model, McNeil's model. And some of the lifespan models are important, but we won't get to them during this presentation. Okay, models grounded in psychotherapy theory. These are rooted in the major theoretical schools of counseling and tend to be based on the supervisor's theory of psychotherapy and counseling. Let's look at the psychodynamic approach first. Usually a supervisor who takes on the psychodynamic approach focuses on transference and countertransference. This includes the supervisee's insight and self-awareness into those issues. We also directly discuss the supervisee's defense mechanisms, how the past influences the present, the process of psychotherapy, meaning what happens session to session to session, what happens between the counselor and the client in the immediacy of the relationship. And we look at conventional approaches and discuss maybe key concepts from those approaches. For example, id, ego, and superego, defense mechanisms, Oedipus complex, drive theory, oral, anal, phallic, and genital stages of development. A common approach to the psychodynamic supervision is interpersonal process recall. Interpersonal process recall, or IPR, is a process that involves usually heavy use of videotape and the supervisee reflecting on their work with the client through review of videotape. So, the process is video or audio tape is played in the supervisory session. The supervisor asks inductive questions to expand the counselor's awareness of interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics going on in the session, and the goal is to facilitate supervisee self-awareness. Here are some examples of inductive questions you might ask during IPR or interpersonal process recall. What do you think the client was trying to say? What do you think the client was feeling at this point? Can you pick up any clues from the client's behavior? What was running through your mind when she said that or did that? How were you feeling at that point? Did anything occur which prevented you from sharing some of your feelings at this point of the session? If you had to do it over again, what might you say to this client? And you can see here how these questions facilitate a sense of self-reflection on the intentionality, on the awareness of dynamics between counselor and client. So, a scenario using psychodynamic supervision. This is a different type of scenario than the depressed client earlier. When reviewing your supervisee's work with an aggressive client, you notice that your counselor is constantly apologizing for confronting the client for his inappropriate behavior, failing to make eye contact, and appears physically intimidated by the size and stature of the client. Essentially, the client is in charge of the session and the setting. As a psychodynamic supervisor, how will you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client? Pause the video now and reflect on that question. The person-centered approach to supervision usually focuses on providing Roger's three core conditions: congruence or genuineness, accurate empathic understanding, and unconditional positive regard. In the person-centered approach, the relationship between counselor-client and supervisor-supervisee has a central focus. The long-term goal is self-actualization of the client or even of the supervisee, and the supervisee's phenomenological perception is important, meaning the supervisee can have a very different interpretation of the session than the supervisor, and that their interpretation is just as important as the supervisor's interpretation, because it tells you about the supervisee's phenomenological experience. So here's another scenario similar to the psychodynamic scenario that you're going to be looking at from a person-centered supervisory position. When reviewing your supervisee's work with an aggressive client, you notice that your counselor is constantly apologizing for confronting the client for his inappropriate behavior, failing to make eye contact, and appears physically intimidated by the size and stature of the client. Essentially, the client is in charge of the session and the setting. So, as a person-centered supervisor, how will you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client? Pause the video now and reflect on that question. The cognitive behavioral approach to supervision believes that great counselors are trained, not born. The focus of the cognitive behavioral approach is therefore on developing skills. Bernard's model is very applicable here in that the supervisor often takes on the role of the teacher in addition to the consultant and the counselor. Supervision focuses on things like modeling, role-playing, feedback, reinforcement of desired behavior, individualized goal setting, and evaluation. For cognitive behavioral supervision to work, the supervisor must have an extensive knowledge of the skills required to successfully counsel another person. In other words, the supervisor usually does a lot of teaching, modeling, reinforcement of specific behaviors or skills, and thus must know those fairly well. So let's look at the cognitive behavioral approach through the teacher, through the counselor, and through the consultant roles using Bernard's discrimination model. I think it's helpful to look at each of these three roles using the CBT model just to show A, how applicable CBT is to Bernard's model, and B, how you could break down Bernard's model using a more theoretical approach. So, if you were taking the teacher role when using a cognitive behavioral approach, you would be directing the client, the supervisee, to read literature about cognitive behavior therapy. You would be instructing the supervisee about the use of CBT approaches. You would be role-playing and modeling. You would be giving evaluative comments and feedback. And you would be reinforcing gains very explicitly. I noticed that you have really made some headway in learning this particular skill, for example. So taking the counselor role rather than the teacher role. In this case, the supervisor would use some of the following methods. They would maybe ask, tell me about the last time you felt stuck with this client. What was happening just before you had this feeling? What thoughts were going through your mind at the time? What did you do in response to your thoughts and feelings? And what happened next? You can see here that we're looking for a chain analysis, if you will, of what exactly occurred in the session, what the supervisee was experiencing in terms of their thoughts, their feelings, and how that resulted in certain consequences. This follows an Albert Ellis kind of model, the ABC model, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy model of CBT. Okay, the consultant role. When the supervisor is taking the consultant role in CBT-oriented supervision, they may look at the degree to which their work is coinciding with the treatment plan. That's the counselor's work. So they review the treatment plan, they review what the counselor is doing with the client, and they may consult in how accurately the counselor is following the treatment plan, or if they need to make modifications or adjustments. In addition, they may ask questions such as, what do you think about reviewing the treatment plan with your client and evaluating the degree to which goals are being met or need to be revised? So they may prompt the supervisee to be meeting with their client and talk about the treatment plan. So you can see that the consulting role here focuses on treatment planning, on measurable outcomes, fairly intensively. So, let's take the aggressive client scenario from earlier, this time from a cognitive behavioral supervisory position. So, read through the slide and pause the video and take some time to reflect on the question. Taking a systemic approach to supervision requires a focus on the systems influencing the counselor-client relationship, as well as the supervisor-supervisee relationship. If you take a systemic approach, the role of the family may be given greater precedence in not only the client's situation, but also the supervisee's response to the client, and perhaps even the supervisor's response to the supervisee. It also requires that the supervisor and the supervisee be able to think at a more cognitively complex level, meaning in order to understand how systems work, it usually requires some understanding of the complexity of interactions. It requires that the supervisor really understand how systems work, and that the supervisee is at a level of development that they can understand those systems and apply those concepts to client cases. That may be possible within stage 1 of Stoltenberg's model. It may not. It depends on the confidence level, but also the cognitively complex level of the supervisee. The constructivist approach usually includes things like narrative and solution-focused therapies. And we're going to look now at solution-focused therapy in the teacher, counselor, and consultant roles, starting backwards this time. So we'll start with the consultant, then move to the counselor, then move to the teacher. So similarly to cognitive behavior therapy, we're going to look at solution-focused therapy using the framework of Bernard's discrimination model. So in the consultant role, a solution-focused supervisor might ask some of these kinds of questions. How might you apply a scaling technique? To what extent do you believe this client is a visitor, a complainant, or a customer? Let's brainstorm some strategies for moving her to the customer role. What strategies have you successfully used with other clients who were not customers? What homework assignments have you tried with her? If the supervisor takes the counselor role using a solution-focused frame, they may also assess, using scaling, exception, presupposition questions, the self-awareness level, the developmental level of the supervisee. For example, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being fully stuck and 1 being not stuck at all, where would you place your work with this client? How are you managing to keep it an 8 instead of a 9 or a 10? Tell me about a time when your work with the client was progressing better. What were you doing at those times? What will be the first sign that you are becoming unstuck? What will you be doing differently? What will the client notice that you are doing differently? You can see here that the solution-focused framework, the kinds of questions that you would use in solution-focused therapy with a client, can be used very productively in solution-focused supervision. Taking the teacher role in solution-focused supervision usually occurs after completing the supervisor-counselor role. It's usually a follow-up to that, and it includes things like questions like, what part of our discussion was most helpful to you? Let's discuss strategies that I used with you, including scaling, exception-finding questions, and presuppositional questions. Pick the strategy that you experienced the most success with, and tell me how you've been able to use it successfully. Identify a strategy that you've had the least success with, and tell me how you will know that you are making progress with it. You can see here that the supervisor is trying to help the supervisee understand how to use some of the techniques of the solution-focused approach. So now we're going to take on the same aggressive client scenario as before. This time you're going to reflect on both how you would proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client from first a systemic supervisory perspective, and second, from a solution-focused supervisory perspective. Pause the video now and reflect on those questions. Okay, we've looked at the goals of supervision, the roles of the supervisor, and we've looked at some approaches to supervision. We're now going to look at setting forth supervision formats. This approaches the concluding part of the training. Supervision formats pertains to how exactly you engage your supervisee in supervision. It's almost the kind of logistics of supervision in a way. There are different formats to supervision. Individual supervision, group supervision, and live supervision are fairly well-known formats of supervision. Individual supervision pertains to dyadic or triadic supervision. Dyadic meaning between the supervisor and supervisee exclusively. Triadic meaning between the supervisor and 2 supervisees at the same time. So you have 3 people in the room versus 2 with dyadic. Group supervision pertains to having multiple people in the room at the same time, and this can include multiple supervisors. Live supervision occurs when the site supervisor or the faculty supervisor is observing the work of the supervisee in real time. That can be in the room with the supervisee and the client. That can be from a one-way mirror or through a video camera. However, but there is some degree of watching the supervisee live and perhaps even intervening at times when needed. As an aside, the City University Master of Arts in Counseling program requires that their students either video or audio tape their work with clients during their field experiences, or in cases where videotaping or audio taping is not feasible or possible, or the clients refuse. Live supervision is required once a quarter, so you may be providing live supervision as part of your work with the supervisee. Group peer supervision may be helpful or a hindrance depending on the kind of supervisees you have in the group. Group peer supervision is when essentially everybody in the group is a supervisee. There's no supervisor in the room. You have to watch for peers who are overly critical or judgmental during group peer supervision. In cases where there seems to be a negative dynamic going on between supervisees, group peer supervision may not be appropriate. At other times, if the supervisees appear very supportive of each other's work, that can be a very useful way for the supervisees to process their own work and then bring that into formal group supervision with their site supervisor. The supervisor must ensure when using peer supervision that the peer format encourages appropriate growth and that peers have a supportive attitude. In terms of how supervision works, usually information is shared by one of the following venues, possibly more than one. Self-report is very common. That's when a supervisee comes into the supervisor's space, perhaps their office, perhaps they go to a different room, and just shares about what's been going on, their own perception of the session. Process notes is when a supervisee might provide their own notes of the session, and that gives you a better sense of flow from session to session to session, particularly if a supervisee has seen the client multiple times. Audio tape or videotape can also be shared to review the specific behaviors of the client but also of the supervisee during the session. And then live observation can also be used for the supervisor to get a real-time perspective of how the counselor is doing, and in addition to that, sometimes live observation can reduce the anxiety of both the supervisee and of the client because of the fear of being videotaped and of messing up or not performing somehow. Even clients can experience some anxiety around that. It should be noted that self-report, while perhaps the most common of those, is not necessarily the most accurate because it's based on just the perceptual experience of the supervisee in the session with the client. And so sometimes it can be useful to gain other corroborative information to balance out whether what the supervisee is experiencing is what others would experience watching that, for example, the supervisor. Group supervision often involves the following kinds of activities. Case staffing, when a client is brought up in front of a team, for example a multidisciplinary team, and their case is discussed. A case presentation, this looks a little different than a case staffing that usually involves other professionals such as perhaps even psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. A case presentation can involve just the supervisor and supervisees in group supervision, and usually does not involve other professional staff working at the organization. And it can also involve written documentation. For example, the supervisee can bring in their treatment plan, can bring in any assessments that they've administered, things like that, into the group supervisory session. Live supervision can use any of the following formats. We mentioned one-way mirrors before and video. It can also use things like a bug in the ear. So that's when a supervisee has a technology-assisted device so that the supervisor can speak directly into their ear. Can be computer-assisted. This can be distracting because usually this involves having messages put up on a computer screen for the supervisee to notice and then to respond to. Intercom or telephone is similarly distracting for that reason, though it is sometimes used, that the supervisee would pick up the telephone and speak with the site supervisor during the course of a session. And then intermittent consultation. For example, in solution-focused therapy, it can be common for a supervisee to leave the session at the maybe 40-minute point, go and visit with the site supervisor or other supervisees, discuss the case, and then come back with some interventions. Jay Haley was very famous for using this kind of approach in family systems theory, known as, I think it's strategic family therapy. Okay, so we've now looked at the goals of supervision. We looked at the roles of the supervisor. We looked at formats and also approaches to supervision. And we've reached the conclusion of our training for today. Hopefully this gave you an overview of what the supervisory process might involve and give you some ideas about how to approach supervision with your supervisees at City University of Seattle and possibly with other organizations you work with. If you have questions about any part of this presentation, if you'd like more information, like to discuss any part of it, please contact the program director, Michael Tyson. His email and phone number are included here. And I hope that this training has been a useful use of your time, that you do feel oriented towards the process of supervision, and that you have an enjoyable training experience with your supervisee. This concludes the training.